Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. So, Alex over at High Top Films once said something that's become kind of a meme in the years since. His opinion that Spider-Man Homecoming may be a pretty good movie, but a bad Spider-Man movie. I'm gonna be honest, I'm a bit jealous since nothing I've said has ever become a meme, but I'm gonna take some inspiration from that idea and say that while Meeseeks and Destroy isn't my favorite episode of Rick and Morty, it's the best Rick and Morty has ever been at being an episode of Rick and Morty. Okay, maybe that sounds a little convoluted, I should probably explain. I think that the show, in its now respectably long run, has made some episodes that I personally like more. But no episode of Rick and Morty has ever distilled the show down to its purest form better than Meeseeks and Destroy. It really has everything the show does well on full display. So in this video, I wanted to dig into that a little bit. Why I love this episode so much, why I think it works as well as it does, and maybe most importantly, why the Meeseeks may still be my favorite guest characters the show ever created.
In theaters now, coming this summer.
Two brothers in a van, and then a meteor hit, and they ran as fast as they could.
Most Rick and Morty episodes have an A and a B plot, and as the show goes on, increasingly a C plot as well. But this episode is really just concerned with the two stories. In the A plot, Morty demands an adventure controlled by him, where he and Rick travel to a fantasy land to have the kind of more traditional Dungeons & Dragons style adventure that Morty really seems to crave. The B plot is about the rest of the family being given a Meeseeks box, where one press of a button creates a creature that is just there to accomplish a single task that you ask of it, and then it disappears. All in all, it's a pretty typical setup for an episode of Rick and Morty, but one executed so well here. Let's start with Rick and Morty's story that sees them going to a fantasy village. What we get with this storyline is something the show would eventually return to over and over again. Morty's longing for more straightforwardly fun adventures. Where Rick is constantly seeing the universe for the depressing and depraved place that it often ends up being in the show, Morty still wants to find some wonder in it, especially in season 1. In many season 4 episodes, like especially in the back half of the season, Morty feels more jaded than he is here. And episodes like this are exactly why. Here we see the pair go on a quest to help some villagers, only to be quickly accused of murder and put on trial for killing a giant that looked suspiciously similar to Dan Harmon. This is the show tapping into something it does extremely well, creating episodes that feature these massive tonal shifts. Now, a lot of animated comedies actually have really unique plotting structures, The Simpsons being one of the best examples. Your average Simpsons episode may start out being about the family on the hunt for a cheap TV after Grandpa breaks theirs, but about 5 to 7 minutes in, they generally take a complete left turn into being about something totally different. In that episode's case, it was that while buying a TV, Marge also finds a fancy dress that gets her accepted into Springfield's high society, and she has to wrestle with the fact that her family doesn't exactly fit in with the town's elite like she can, because that's what the best of The Simpsons usually does. It takes the generally more wacky events of the first act into a direction that you never saw coming. Now, Rick and Morty's structure is very different, but one thing I think it has in common with The Simpsons is that love of these huge departures in the story that you think you're getting. Like, you might go into this episode expecting a riff on D&D and fantasy tropes, and pretty soon you find yourself watching a short parody of a Law & Order style police procedural. This is part of what made the show feel so fresh and different, and that's not even getting into the extreme tonal shift that happens in the last few minutes of this story. The controversial scene where Morty is almost sexually assaulted in a bathroom. I remember a lot of conversations surrounding this at the time, asking whether or not the show went too far here. I can really only speak for myself because I don't think it's my place to tell you how to feel about something as serious as that. But for me personally, while I'm glad the show doesn't lean on this kind of stuff too often, I think it works well in the context of the episode. The scene isn't played for laughs at all. And in terms of the overall season, I think the kindness that Rick shows Morty after the attack, and the understanding that he seems to have that something is off here, were kind of the first hints that Rick actually cared about Morty's well-being much at all. which added an interesting dimension to the character that I wasn't sure was there before. To this day, the question of how much Rick actually cares about Morty, and how capable he is of caring about anyone at all, is a very foundational question to the show. And the episode's post-credits scene, where the villagers discover how horrible King Jellybean actually was, and decide to burn the evidence in order to maintain the figure that he represented, is, to this day, probably the most disturbing scene in the show for me. And it perfectly sums up one of the guiding principles the show seems to have. There is no carefree, storybook perfect places in the universe. It doesn't matter if you're in the suburbs on Earth, a theme park planet, or in a village that feels straight out of Xena Warrior Princess. The universe will always be messier, rougher, and more disappointing than you expect. This is a theme that emerges over and over again throughout the show, and has never been expressed more clearly in an episode of Rick and Morty than it is here. But okay, that's a little depressing, so it's probably a good time to shift focus to the B-plot, and what this episode is most remembered for, the Meeseeks. The Meeseeks are such a simple idea. They're basically one-wish genies with very silly voices, but they've become iconic because of how the episode uses them. Jerry is Jerry, so of course, even though Summer and Beth's wishes seem way harder to accomplish, it's Jerry's simple wish to take 2 strokes off his golf game that almost gets an entire restaurant full of people killed. Again, with the Meeseeks, we see one of the show's favorite tropes. Taking something that seems so goofy and maybe even lovable at first, and peeling it back to reveal the darkness underneath. That almost sounds too serious when talking about something as silly as the Meeseeks, but I think the episode earns it. I mean, honestly, some of my favorite lines ever written for this show are the Meeseeks' big monologue at the restaurant, about how they don't come into this world fumbling for purpose, and how they live in constant pain just wanting to die. Add to that the hostage lady screaming, "Oh my god, what about your short game?" And this is one of the most purely funny scenes in the show's history for me. I love how this episode ends with Beth and Jerry's marriage being patched up a bit in the last act, only for the next episode to see them worse off than ever. I remember a lot of people at the time saying that they just ignored this ending, but I don't know. It feels really realistic to me that Beth and Jerry could have this special moment together, only for them to go back to their usual miserable dynamic a few days later. In the cynical and often mean universe of Rick and Morty, that makes a lot of sense to me. Meeseeks and Destroy may not be my favorite episode of the show, but if I had to show someone who had never seen Rick and Morty before what this show was, this would probably be the episode I'd choose. I mean, just look at the ending, where Rick directly addresses the audience with a self-aware, lame catchphrase. It makes absolutely no sense with the episode that came before it, and that's why it's so fun. It's the episode using those extreme and surprising tonal shifts to its advantage one last time. Almost everything that Rick and Morty does well is shown off here, and for that alone, it feels like probably the most definitive episode from season 1.
We've been walking for a while and I got this baby in a tube here.
Maybe it's some sort of crazy upgrade. Hold on, I've got an idea.
Hey, stop!
If you want to hear more of my thoughts on Rick and Morty, I have some great news. I actually have a video up right now on my streaming video service Nebula. It's in the working title series that focuses entirely on the show's deceptively simple title sequence. That's actually my second working titles video, and one of many in the series that's covered everything from Game of Thrones to Batman the Animated Series. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with Nebula, which features videos from tons of creators you'll recognize, like Lindsay Ellis, Patrick H. Willems, and Middle 8. Plus, if you sign up through Curiosity Stream, you'll also get a great documentary streaming service at the same time, featuring docs on history, science, tech, and a ton more. So to sign up to watch my new Rick and Morty video and get all of these services for the insanely low price of $2.99 a month, go to curiositystream.com/captainmidnight. That's curiositystream.com/captainmidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.